Picture a place where roughly 33,000 people live stacked inside the footprint of a single city block, about the size of 4 football fields placed side by side, and you begin to understand Kowloon walled city. For nearly half a century in the heart of Hong Kong, a 6.4-acre patch of land became a nation unto itself, an ungoverned, self-built, 14-story megastructure where 350 buildings grew together into one organism. Britain claimed it but wouldn't police it. China claimed it but wouldn't govern it. So the residents simply built, upward, inward, into every cubic foot of available air until the city became, by most reasonable calculations, the most densely populated place that has ever existed on Earth. Hi everyone, Ken here. Hit the subscribe button and let's uncover Kowloon walled city. The story starts long before any of those famous photographs were taken. The site of the northeast Kowloon Peninsula had hosted a Chinese imperial outpost since at least the 15th century. Around 1810, after Chinese forces abandoned a coastal fort on Tunglung Island, the Qing built a small replacement on the site. The walls themselves came later, and they came as a direct response to the British. After the 1842 Treaty of Nanking ceded Hong Kong Island to the United Kingdom, Qing officials decided to fortify the Kowloon shore in plain sight of the new colony. The result was a 6.4-acre rectangle, roughly 690 by 390 feet, ringed by a granite wall 13 feet tall and 15 feet thick, with 4 gates and 6 watchtowers. Then came the document that broke everything, the Convention for the Expansion of Hong Kong Territory, signed in Beijing on June 9th of 1898. The convention leased the new territories to Britain for 99 years, a lease that would famously expire on June 30th of 1997. But buried in the convention was a peculiar exception. Kowloon walled city, then home to about 700 people, was carved out. Chinese officials and troops could remain so long as they didn't interfere with the British. It was a diplomatic compromise that satisfied no one and created a sovereignty paradox. For the next 4 decades, almost nothing happened, but what happened next is one of the greatest accidents of urban history. During the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong from 1941 to 1945, occupying forces dismantled the granite. By the end of the war, the physical boundaries of the enclave had vanished. What remained was only a legal ghost, an outline on paper, an unenforceable claim, a piece of land nobody could quite say belonged to anyone. Then came the refugees. The renewed Chinese Civil War sent waves of people fleeing south, and the founding of the People's Republic in 1949 accelerated the flood. By 1947, around 2,000 squatters had already moved into the unwalled enclosure. Within a few years, there were tens of thousands. They came mostly from Guangdong, many from the Chuchao communities that would shape the city's food culture for decades, and they built first in wood, then concrete, then upward. The British, terrified of provoking Beijing, declined to enforce planning, sanitation, or building codes inside the old footprint. Hong Kong Governor Sir Alexander Grantham described the place in unsparing terms, a cesspool of iniquity where vices, brothels, and worse operated openly. When the Public Works Department actually tried to demolish the squatter housing in January of 1948, the result was an international crisis. Residents rioted, demonstrators in Canton stormed Shenin Island and burned the British consulate. The Republic of China's Foreign Ministry sent a sharp memorandum to London asserting Chinese jurisdiction. The British calculated that the walled city wasn't worth a war, retreated into a posture they would maintain for the next 40 years, accepting Chinese jurisdiction in principle, while persuading the Chinese not to attempt to exercise it in practice. In short, nobody was in charge, and in that vacuum, a city built itself. By the 1980s, Kowloon was something no architect had ever planned and no city planner had ever approved. The 6.4-acre footprint held roughly 350 interconnected high-rises, most of them between 10 and 14 stories tall. There was a hard ceiling on how high anyone could build, and it was imposed not by law, but by Boeing. Kai-Tak Airport sat just 800 meters south, and 747s came in so low over the rooftops that in some of the most famous photographs ever taken of the city, you can see the underbellies of jets passing just overhead. Everyone understood, without anyone ever writing it down, that you did not build above 14 stories tall. Inside, the building shared no foundation and obeyed no setbacks. Upper floors were cantilevered outward to gain a few extra square feet, which meant the higher you climbed, the wider the buildings became, and the darker the alleys below grew. The original interior had been organized around 8 main streets, but by the time the city peaked, the Hong Kong Housing Department counted 83 distinct streets and alleys, most only 1 or 2 meters wide, threading through an interior so dense that fluorescent lights burned 24 hours a day at street level. Residents told time by clocks on their walls and by which shops were open because sunlight rarely penetrated to the ground. The peak population is, depending on which source you trust, somewhere between 33,000 and 50,000. The most rigorous number comes from a thorough Hong Kong government survey conducted on January 14th of 1987, which counted approximately 33,000 residents in roughly 350 buildings. To put that in perspective, that's about 200 times the density of Hong Kong as a whole and roughly 120 times the density of Manhattan. There is no other place in the recorded history of human settlement that has ever come close. Here is the part of the story that most people get wrong. The popular image of Kowloon walled city, pushed in tabloid headlines and lurid documentaries for decades, is one of pure lawlessness, intoxicants, brothels, and violence in dark alleys. And in the 1950s and 1960s, that wasn't entirely unfair. Triad societies ran illicit substances, gambling parlors, and prostitution on an industrial scale. A 1959 murder inside the city forced the issue into Hong Kong's courts, and the colonial government formally ruled that Hong Kong did indeed have jurisdiction. In practice, that ruling changed almost nothing. Police entered only in large groups and only occasionally. What changed everything was the 1973 to 1974 police crackdown. The campaign launched more than 3,500 raids, made over 2,500 arrests, and seized roughly 4,000 pounds of illicit substances. Triad influence inside the city collapsed almost overnight. By 1983, the commander of the Kowloon City District Police openly declared the walled city's crime rate to be under control. By the late 1960s, multiple residents and researchers reported something that genuinely surprised the outside world. The official crime rate inside the walled city was lower than the Hong Kong average. And the Hong Kong government, after years of resistance, quietly began providing services. 8 municipal standpipes were installed inside the city as public water taps. Hong Kong Post began delivering mail, and the power company gradually replaced the chaotic web of stolen connections with formal metering. What life inside the city actually looked like depended entirely on what door you opened. By the late 1980s, the city contained around 8,500 businesses and 10,700 households. The economy ran on a single principle: nothing inside the walled city was regulated, which meant anything cheaper or faster or more useful that couldn't get a license outside could thrive inside. The most famous example was dentistry. The British colonial system required dentists to hold UK or Hong Kong qualifications, which meant that Chinese-trained practitioners, many of them refugees from the mainland with years of experience, were forbidden to practice anywhere in Hong Kong except inside the walled city. So they set up shop with brightly lit signs facing the street so walk-in patients from Kowloon proper could see them. Their fees were a fraction of those charged outside. People came from across Hong Kong for cheap fillings, extractions, and dentures. Unlicensed doctors also operated under similar economics. Then there was the food industry, which is where the city's real economic clout sat. At one point, by widely cited estimates, as much as 80% of the fish balls consumed in Hong Kong were produced inside the Kowloon walled city. The rooftops themselves were the city's lungs. Once you climbed up, the whole city became a single connected plane, a kind of high-altitude village where children ran from building to building, the elderly socialized in folding chairs, women hung laundry, men kept and raised pigeons, and a forest of TV antennas swayed every time a 747 came into land. For decades, the diplomatic deadlock that protected the walled city from demolition seemed permanent. Then in 1984, Britain and China signed a joint declaration which formally arranged the return of all of Hong Kong to Chinese sovereignty by 1997. The deadlock evaporated. With both sides now agreed on the city's eventual destination, there was no longer any diplomatic reason to leave it standing. On January 14, 1987, the British Hong Kong government and the People's Republic of China jointly announced that the walled city would be demolished and replaced with a public park. The same morning, 400 officials from the housing department arrived to begin household-by-household surveys. The compensation package eventually totaled the equivalent of around $350 million at the time, administered by a special committee of the Hong Kong Housing Authority, with per-flat compensation. Most residents accepted relatively quickly, and by November 1991, only 457 households were still negotiating, and forced evictions removed the last residents in 1992. For a few months, the abandoned city stood empty, ringed by a wire fence laid almost exactly along the line of the original granite wall. Then on March 23, 1993, the actual demolition began. It took just over a year, with the work concluding in April of 1994. What replaced it is one of the more thoughtful pieces of memorial architecture anywhere in Asia, Kowloon Walled City Park. The park preserves several remarkable artifacts of the city it replaced. The temptation with a place like this is to treat it like a freak show, a cautionary tale about what happens when the state walks away. That story isn't entirely false. The conditions inside Kowloon Walled City were genuinely difficult. Poor sanitation, dripping pipes, fire risk, the slow saturation of groundwater by failing sewers, and the perpetual roar of traffic overhead. People got hurt, children grew up in apartments that had never seen direct sunlight. But the residents who lived through it, and the photographers and researchers who documented it, almost all described something more complicated. Once the triads were broken in the mid-1970s, the city became, by most measures, a working-class neighborhood that happened to have no government. It produced an enormous share of Hong Kong's everyday food. It housed thousands of families in apartments that, while small, they owned outright. It supported schools, churches, kindergartens, community associations. It functioned day after day on a system of self-organization that no architect or planner had imagined could work. That is the real puzzle of Kowloon Walled City. Not how a place this dense and ungoverned could be so dangerous, but how a place this dense and ungoverned could in the end be so livable. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. What are your thoughts on Kowloon Walled City? Do you think it would be possible to replicate this level of population density today, or do you think it will always just be a one-off? Let me know down below in the comments section, and while you're there, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an exciting episode of This House.